Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 605, The Final Frontier, Part 1. So, now that I've taken 3 weeks to answer a patron request question, let's tackle a nice, straightforward subject that I'm sure will take me no time at all: imperialism. Specifically, patron Andre pointed out a rather large gap in my coverage of the history of the Japanese Empire. We've talked about Taiwan. We've talked about Korea, we've talked about Micronesia and Hokkaido and Okinawa, but we have not, at least not substantially, talked about Manchuria. And of course, Manchuria is in many ways one of the most famous examples of Japanese colonialism, if for no other reason than that Japan's open split with the international community and growing isolation in the 1930s stemmed from its invasion of Manchuria. But the story of Manchuria and Japan goes back quite a bit further than the 1930s, and the Japanese era in Manchuria has a lot more significance than just this was what got Japan to leave the League of Nations. So let's talk about it. To what extent does Manchuria fit the mold of the rest of the Japanese Empire? To what extent does it not? First things first, though, what the hell is Manchuria? Where even is that? The what is unfortunately a bit complicated, the where, thankfully, is rather straightforward. Presumably, if you listen to this podcast, you are at least loosely aware where Japan is. I mean, I really hope you are. It's a podcast, so it's kind of hard for me to show you. You are also, in turn, presumably aware that Korea is next to Japan. Manchuria is, in turn, the part of China that is on top of Korea, so to speak, the region that is bounded by the Yalu River to the south, which is the Korea-China border, and the Amur River to the north and east, and by a series of mountainous passes leading into China proper from the west. My old Chinese history teacher used to put it rather straightforwardly, if comically: modern China, looking at it, loosely resembles a giant chicken. Manchuria is the head of the chicken peeking out over Korea. Is that a silly analogy? Absolutely. Does it help me remember? Well, it's been almost 20 years since I first heard that explanation, so you be the judge. Now we get to the what is Manchuria part, and this is a little bit more complicated. As the name Manchuria might imply, it is home to a group of people called the Manchu, and here we have to get into the complex web of ethnic history in China. So to start, in America and many places outside of Asia in general, there tends not to be much of an awareness of the finer gradations of Chinese identity, but China is in reality a very ethnically diverse place. There are, in the modern People's Republic of China, 56 officially recognized ethnic groups, many more that are, for whatever reason, not officially classified as ethnic groups, even if they see themselves that way. However, the majority of China's population, 91-ish%, is Han Chinese. This is the ethnic and cultural group we most associate with the long history of dynastic China. The term Han people first started being used about 1500 years ago and is a reference to the Han Dynasty, one of the earliest and longest-lasting dynasties of Chinese history, and the one that helped formalize the model of China's dynastic emperor system after the short reign of the previous Qin dynasty. The Han people then were associated with that dynastic history, which was centered on the Yellow and to a lesser extent Yangtze River valleys. There are subdivisions within Han identity, mostly between groups that remained in the plains of northern China and those who fled south to escape the dynastic wars that took place before the Tang dynasty and settled in the Yangtze and other parts of China further south. But generally, Han peoples share a similar language, though the Mandarin you learn today is specifically the standardized Beijing dialect. There are many branches of what are called the Sinitic languages. For example, Cantonese is the best-known variant of the Yue branch of Sinitic languages, and all Sinitic languages are associated with the umbrella of the Han people. There are also a lot of cultural similarities across Han Chinese people, from some form of attachment to Confucianism and to a lesser extent Taoism, to, for the most part, organizing in settled agricultural societies. Eventually, the lands associated with the Han Chinese would spread out into a sort of oval shape across central China, from the southern coast and the island of Hainan up to more or less where Beijing is now. That same old teacher of mine used to say that the Han homelands were the egg from which the chicken of China sprang. Again, pretty memorable. But along the borders, there have always been other ethnic groups in the orbit of China, sometimes as vassals, sometimes as subjects, other times as conquerors. The Manchu are one of those groups. The Manchu themselves are loosely related to another branch of China's ethnic minorities you probably heard of, the Mongols. The Mongols, of course, were themselves the rulers of China for about 150 years after Genghis Khan and his descendants successfully conquered the Jin and southern Song dynasties in the 1200s. In the 1360s, though, the Mongols were driven out of China by what became the Ming dynasty, but the future Ming emperors would always be watching their northern borders very carefully, anxious at the potential that the Mongol threat might re-emerge. Neighboring the Mongol lands to the east were the lands of the Jurchens, the former rulers of China's Jin dynasty, because the Mongols were also not the first non-Han people to invade and rule a part of China, setting up their own dynasty in the process. During the Ming dynasty, the Jurchen were a very disunited lot. They lived in the wide open plains to the northeast of what's now Beijing, beyond the frontiers of the Ming dynasty, and were divided between many different communities, some practicing slash-and-burn agriculture, others semi or fully nomadic. However, in the late 1500s, a new Jurchen leader named Nurhaci would emerge and unite all of the disparate Jurchen groups under his rule into a new kingdom modeled on dynastic China. His descendants, in turn, would be the ones to stop calling themselves Jurchen and begin using a new name of somewhat unclear origin, Manchu. Manchuria, thus, is the region associated with the rise of the Manchu. It is the Manchu homeland. More importantly for our purposes, Nurhaci and his descendants didn't just successfully unite the Jurchen. They were able to establish an alliance with the fractured princes of the Mongols still living in Mongolia proper, who had been divided since the days of the Great Khans, and together they invaded and crushed the Ming dynasty. Nurhaci's descendants would go on to be the emperors of the last dynasty of imperial China, the Qing, which was ruled by the Manchu as a distinct ethnic ruling group with the assistance of their Mongol allies. Thus, for example, the most powerful emperor in Chinese history, the Qianlong Emperor, who ruled over the height of the Qing dynasty in the 1700s and who, by size, ruled an empire far larger than even China today, was ethnically Manchu. His descendants would rule that empire as it began to fall apart, and the last of them, Emperor Puyi, would be the last emperor of China in its history, and we will have much more to say about Puyi in a couple episodes. Anyway, again, lots of fun Chinese history, but we want to keep it contained to what matters for our story, and for our story, what matters is that the mighty Manchu-led empire of the Qing dynasty was, by the late 1800s, starting to collapse. Much of this, of course, was the same problems Chinese dynasties always had. The empire was vast and hard to rule effectively, and corruption, banditry, bad harvests, the need to keep taxes low so as to appear a good, benevolent Confucian ruler, all the classic problems of imperial China were constantly rearing their head. But there was also a fresh problem to deal with, most notably Western imperial encroachment, particularly after the First and Second Opium Wars in the mid-1800s. Those wars, which were both disasters for China, really delegitimated the Manchu ruling class, which was forced to sign a series of humiliating unequal treaties opening ports in China to Western trade and ceding territories like Hong Kong and Shanghai to Western managers. In the wake of these humiliations, the growing sentiment among the Han Chinese in China proper was that the Manchu leadership was not equal to the task of getting China through these uncertain times. And so in the late 1800s in China, you see growing sentiment among the Han Chinese population that Manchu rule needed to end. The most famous incarnation of that sentiment, of course, was the Tongmenghui, the movement founded by one of the most important figures in modern Chinese history, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Sun was ethnically mixed of Cantonese, one of the Han subgroups, and Hakka descent, the Hakka being another Chinese ethnic minority. He was from Guangdong on the southern coast of China, and became the leading exponent of what was called Chinese republicanism, the movement to overthrow the imperial system itself. He's an absolutely fascinating figure, one of very few in modern Chinese history, who is popular both in Taiwan and in mainland China for his contribution to creating the modern Chinese nation-state. And again, his life is really complicated and well beyond the scope of what we can cover here. Simply put, he was educated in Hawaii back when it was still an independent kingdom, and initially aimed to be a medical doctor before he was radicalized by the mounting failures of the Qing dynasty in the 1890s. His anti-Qing activism, of course, put him on the wrong side of the law before too long. He actually ended up hiding out for a long time in Japan, where he had a lot of admirers who believed ending the Qing dynasty was necessary to modernize China and strengthen Japan's most important neighbor in the face of Western Empire. Sun himself was an admirer of some of the Meiji reforms in Japan, and the Tongmenghui was actually founded in Japan out of a merger of anti-Qing revolutionary groups, because Japan was one of the only places they could operate openly without being targeted by agents of the Qing dynasty. Sun and his colleagues were in the end able to overthrow the Qing dynasty, but when its end came, it was kind of abrupt. In its final decades, the Qing dynasty faced a series of disastrous humiliations. Defeat by Japan in the Sino-Japanese War, the disastrous 1900 Boxer Rebellion, where the dynasty threw its support behind the anti-Western Boxer movement, only to have Beijing itself largely burned to the ground when foreign armies showed up to put the Boxers down. Attempts to reform the administration of the Qing dynasty were largely unsuccessful, and the biggest one that did succeed in 1905 really changed how the Confucian exam system used to staff the government bureaucracy worked, which in turn massively alienated the families of bureaucrats who had trained their whole lives to succeed on those exams. And given that those bureaucrats were one of the biggest blocks of people who still supported the Qing dynasty and now had no reason to, that wasn't great. Despite these mini missteps, the end of the Qing dynasty was so unexpected that Sun Yat-sen was actually in Colorado fundraising for another rebellion, all his previous ones had failed, when he got the news. A military garrison at Wuhan in central China had revolted against its commanders, and that revolt spread very rapidly through much of central and southern China. Before long, it became clear big swaths of the Qing military no longer supported the dynasty, and within a couple of months, the last Qing emperor decided to abdicate. The new Republic of China, which was proclaimed on New Year's Day 1912, would not have much of an easy go of it. Sun Yat-sen, of course, would be its first president, leader of a new national political party formed out of his old revolutionary group, which was called the Kuomintang. But before long, he'd be forced to flee as one of the military figures who supported the new government, Yuan Shikai, tried to seize control and make himself a new emperor, which didn't go great, and also Yuan died of cancer within a few years. And in the aftermath of that train wreck, the Republican government largely collapsed as regional military warlords began to seize control of growing swaths of the country. Those warlords would be kind of brought to heel by one of Sun Yat-sen's followers, the new leader of the Kuomintang, a general named Chiang Kai-shek, who'd trained a national revolutionary army to serve as the Kuomintang's armed wing, and then marched north from his base in southern China in the 1920s to bring the warlords to heel. However, the new appearance of unity belied the actual reality. Most of the warlords who surrendered to Chiang got good deals that made them subordinate to his government on paper, but largely independent in reality. Theoretically, Chiang's government ruled a somewhat unified China, but in practice, his control of that unified China was pretty shaky at best. Which brings us at long last back to Manchuria, now that I've done what I think is a pretty good job of summarizing a very complicated part of Chinese history, thank you very much. As you might imagine, the Manchu, as the rulers of the old Qing dynasty, were not exactly popular with a lot of Chinese nationalists either before or during the early years of the new republic. Republicans like Sun were not always clear about what they saw as the role for the Manchu people in the new republic. Initially, Sun himself had expressed a desire for the Han homelands of China to become their own territory, independent of the other ethnic minorities of China, but eventually he came around to the position of a unitary republic that included both the Han and other ethnic groups on the outlying edges of the Han homelands like the Manchu and Mongols. This is, as an aside, the reason why the original flag of the Republic of China was called the five-color flag. It's 5 horizontal stripes in order from top to bottom: red, yellow, blue, white, and black, representing the 5 largest ethnic groups in the new republic, or at least the territory claimed by that republic: the Han Chinese, the Manchus, the Mongols, Chinese Muslims, both Hui and Turkic, and Tibetans. The thing was, while Sun and his nationalists eventually came around to the position of including these people in the new China, not all these ethnic groups were super keen on the message of unity. Some, like the Mongol princes, had been loyal to the Qing dynasty specifically and had no attachment to China as a concept. Others, like the Tibetans, had relied on a carefully crafted ambiguous relationship with the Qing dynasty. The Dalai Lama and the Emperor had signed a treaty a few centuries back, essentially saying the Dalai Lama was the Emperor's spiritual protector, the Qing Emperor was the Dalai Lama's physical one, thus each one could claim to have gotten the superior role, and the relationship was broadly kept ambiguous. Yet other groups, like the Muslim Uyghurs of Xinjiang, were kept under control by military force. After the fall of the Qing dynasty, all of these outlying ethnic groups tried to break away from China, but in the end only the Mongols succeeded, because they alone got substantial support from an outside power, Russia. That's why Mongolia today is an independent country. Tibet and Xinjiang are not. What about Manchuria? Well, the Manchu were in a somewhat awkward position here because of the unique history of the last few decades of the Qing dynasty. So, for most of the history of the Qing dynasty, Manchuria itself was kept as a protected homeland for the Manchu peoples. Non-Manchu were generally not allowed to settle in the region for any reason, the goal being to maintain a distinct Manchu homeland that Manchu families could return to, lowering the chance the Manchu themselves would assimilate the culture of their Han subjects, as had happened so many times before in Chinese history. However, over time those restrictions started to break down. The reasons why are complicated, but partially it was a matter of simple enforcement. Keeping Han settlers who wanted access to the fertile plains of Manchuria for farming out of the area was simply hard to do because it was a big area to patrol. Some Qing emperors also allowed Han resettlement into the major towns of Manchuria as part of disaster relief programs or as ways to open up new tax revenue with farming. Eventually, the Qing emperors lifted the restrictions altogether for one big reason. Most of Manchuria, particularly the interior plains, were lightly populated. The Qing rulers were concerned that another neighboring power, Russia, was aiming to step in and seize those lands for itself. Thus, Han people were allowed to settle in Manchuria in larger numbers for, somewhat ironically, the exact same reason that Japan was, at the exact same time, beginning to settle large numbers of people in Hokkaido. A denser population would make it harder for the Russians to invade. And oh boy did the Russians want Manchuria. The major reason had to do with geography. In the 1850s, the Russians forced the weakened Qing dynasty, which was facing down the Second Opium War with France and the UK and the massive civil conflict known as the Taiping Rebellion, to cede much of what was then called Outer Manchuria up to the coast of the Sea of Japan to Russia. This gave the Russian Empire something it had wanted for a long time: space to build a Pacific port as far south as possible in what became Vladivostok, so that port could be open for as much of the year as possible. But that cession of territory came with a new problem. You see, by the mid-1800s, the main link holding together Russia's empire in northern Asia was a network of railways stretching back to European Russia, the most densely populated and developed part of the empire. But the geography of the remainder of Manchuria still under China's control put Manchuria between the Russian rail lines in Siberia and Vladivostok. To connect Vladivostok back to Moscow, the Russians would either need to go many miles out of their way during construction, or find a way to build through Manchuria. So powerful forces back in Moscow were already eyeing up Manchuria, and that was what brought the region to the attention of Meiji Japan, because at the same time, the Russians were also eyeing another place of far greater concern to Japan's nascent empire, Korea. Korea's Joseon dynasty had ruled the peninsula since the 1390s and had been a loyal ally and tributary first of the Ming and then Qing dynasties for about that long. When the founders of the new Meiji state in Japan overthrew the last shogunate and established the modern Japanese nation-state, Korea was at the top of their diplomatic and military priorities. All the leaders of the Meiji state were schooled enough in Japanese history to know that the one serious attempt to invade Japan itself, the Mongol invasions of the 1270s and 1280s, had been staged largely out of Korea. They were equally aware that powers like the UK and, of course, Russia were eyeing Korea in the modern day as a potential colonial outpost. The leaders of this government, men like Ito Hirobumi, Inoue Kaoru, and Saigo Takamori, tended to be pretty unsentimental about international politics, and none of them really believed in some notion of Asian solidarity against Western imperialism. The general line of thinking in Tokyo was that if Korea was not strong enough to guard its own independence, it was only a matter of time before someone took it over, and if that was inevitable, better Japan than anybody else. We're not going to get too deep into the Japanese conquest of Korea here because I'm already really behind schedule and this outline is more than half filled up. The short version is that this rationale, Korea was going to be carved up by somebody, so it might as well be Japan, was essentially the motivating factor for Japan's growing interference in Korean domestic politics in the 1880s. In 1894, when Japan finally went to war with China to assert its dominance over Korea, that war was fought primarily in Korea and of course was a smashing victory for Japan, making the region a Japanese protectorate and eventually resulting in its annexation 15 years later. And it was during this initial conquest of Korea that Russia-Japan tensions began to mount. The more reform-minded members of Korea's royal court had seen Russia as a useful counterweight to Japanese influence, and in the final years of Korean independence, Korea and Russia had drifted very close to each other. But the real spark of Japan-Russia tensions, and what brought Japan into Manchuria for the first time, was what came next. You see, bringing Korea into Japan's sphere of influence was really a decision driven by military policy, particularly army leaders, who remembered the rather chilling statement of one of the Germans hired to teach them modern warfare, Clemens Wilhelm Jakob Meckel, that, quote, Korea was a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. This is one of the unique things, by the way, about Japanese imperialism. It was overwhelmingly driven by the military and strategic calculations in the army and navy leadership, where if you look at the UK, for example, you see a lot more emphasis on imperialism as an economic benefit to the motherland. But once Korea was established as a Japanese buffer state to protect Japan, the army then had to protect Korea. And that was why, in the eventual peace deal with China, Japan didn't just get protection over Korea, it seized some Chinese territory just north of Korea to protect its new buffer state. That territory was the Liaodong Peninsula, which juts out into the East China Sea just above the Yalu River, which demarcates the border between Korea and China. The Liaodong Peninsula had a few things going for it. First, it was home to an excellent port connecting back to the Japanese mainland in the form of Dalian, which you sometimes hear called Dairen during this period, that's the Japanese pronunciation. If that was not enough, there was a second nearby harbor in Lushunko, which you also sometimes hear called Port Arthur, after an English navigator who helped chart it. Second, the Liaodong Peninsula is a peninsula. That meant the ways in and out were pretty limited and thus easy to fortify and defend, and an army having to invade Korea would either have to find a way to breach those defenses or risk leaving a giant enemy fortress at their backs as they advanced. So it made sense why Japanese negotiators who ironed out the peace deal with the Qing dynasty in 1895, chiefly Ito Hirobumi and Mutsu Munemutsu if you're curious, wanted the Liaodong Peninsula to protect their new acquisition. But they weren't the only ones who saw the obvious advantages. The court of Nicholas II in Moscow was just as aware of them. So only 5 days after the inking of the final treaty with China, the German, Russian, and French ambassadors in Tokyo delivered an ultimatum. Japan should withdraw from the Liaodong Peninsula for the stability of Asia in exchange for a cash payment, or else. The Russian interest here was pretty obvious, made all the more so when the Japanese government, backed into a corner in a potential 3-on-1 fight, agreed to the terms, and just a few years later, Russia swooped in and forced a new treaty on China leasing all the territory Japan had just vacated. But why would Germany and France want to join Russia in demanding that Japan give that territory up so Russia could grab it? Well, chiefly because they both saw Russia as a potentially useful ally, ironically largely because they both expected to fight each other in the next few decades, and were trying to flip the Russians over to their side. Simply put, both governments felt that making Nicholas II happy mattered more than pissing off the Japanese. It probably also didn't hurt that the Qing dynasty was so weakened by defeat at the hands of Japan that in addition to Russia, both Britain and France were able to force new unequal treaties, seizing yet more territory from the dynasty. This moment, the so-called Triple Intervention of 1895, incensed Japanese public opinion, and the Russian move into Manchuria a few years later provoked deep anxieties among Japanese leaders. In the aftermath of the Triple Intervention, Russian negotiators convinced the Chinese to sign over rights to build a railway connection, which they named the Chinese Eastern Railway, connecting with the Trans-Siberian Line and cutting across Manchuria, with a separate line, the South Manchuria Railway, branching down to the Liaodong Peninsula and Russia's new leased territory there. The town that would serve as the junction between these two rail lines was also given to Russia as a concession. A Polish architect would take the village that lay there, Harbin, and transform it within a few years into a sprawling Russian-dominated metropolis. On its face, the territorial control Russia now exercised in Manchuria was not massive. The two land concessions in Dalian down on the Liaodong Peninsula and Harbin at the center, plus the two rail lines running east-west across Manchuria and south from Harbin to Dalian. The treaty did give Russia direct control over the rail lines, plus all the land for 1 mile on either side of the rail line, but that only totaled up to a couple hundred square miles, plus another 1,300 square miles in the Liaodong Peninsula leased for 25 years, out of a region that's about 600,000 square miles. Russia was far from controlling the whole thing. But the moves deeply concerned military leaders in Tokyo because they understood that railways were not just a matter of convenient transportation. Or I guess to put it another way, convenient transportation was not benign. A faster rail connection between Moscow and Vladivostok meant that directives from the Tsar could go east faster, that the region could be more economically integrated into Russia, and that settlers from the east could arrive to stabilize Russian control over the region, and of course in a crisis soldiers could get there faster. Yamagata Aritomo, the leader of the Japanese army and one of the founders of the Meiji state, had put the issue succinctly in a letter in 1888. Quote, "The day the Trans-Siberian Railway is completed will be the day crisis comes to Korea, and when crisis comes to Korea, all the Orient will face upheaval." Japanese leaders saw that Russian presence in Manchuria was a direct threat to their position in Korea, and this created a lot of momentum towards war between Japan and Russia. After all, Nicholas II's advisors were not shy about their goal of further expansion in Asia to secure Russia's position there, and Japanese leaders were well aware that Korea was a potential future target. Russia did not recognize Japan's new status as Korea's protector after the Sino-Japanese War, and by the early 20th century, rumors were swirling that the Russians were trying to secretly negotiate treaty rights with the Korean government. In other words, basically agreeing to a deal. Russia helps kick Japan out in exchange for the right to base Russian warships in places like Busan. This gets kind of at the heart of Meiji imperialism. Generally speaking, Meiji leaders like Ito Hirobumi were imperialists of opportunity, for lack of a better term. Ito repeatedly cautioned the other members of the government leadership that Japan should never be too aggressive in trying to build an empire. Better, he said, to be viewed by the West with benign and dismissive non-interest than to be seen as a serious imperial rival. Thus, for example, taking Taiwan as a Japanese colony after the Sino-Japanese War had been pure opportunism. The Qing dynasty couldn't stop Japan from taking the territory, and that was reason enough. Had the Qing dynasty been able to, or had, say, Britain or France objected to Japan taking over the island, the Meiji leadership would have backed down. But that caution didn't apply to anything perceived as a genuine military threat, and Russia's position in Asia was increasingly seen in Tokyo as a genuine threat. And this tension, of course, culminated in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, the scope of which, once again, is a bit beyond us here. Suffice it to say, this was a much closer affair than the Sino-Japanese War 10 years earlier. Japan lost more military casualties in the first battle of the Russo-Japanese War than in the whole of the Sino-Japanese War. And yet Japan still won the day, and with it, the beginning of its foothold in Manchuria. You see, before the war even began, the foreign minister, Baron Komura Jutaro, laid out pretty clearly what he felt Japan's war aims against Russia should be. Quote, "In recent years, the great powers have been industriously expanding their claims in East Asia. Each seizes even the slightest opportunities to acquire concessions out of fear of being outdone by the other. For this reason, we too must avail ourselves of opportunity and develop our national strength by endeavoring in this interest to expand our claims in Manchuria. If we carefully examine China's domestic and international situation, it is clear in the long run there is little hope for the country to maintain its independence and territorial integrity. Sooner or later, China will encounter its tragic destiny. We expect it will collapse and be carved up like a melon." Given that such an eventuality has an extremely important bearing on our interests and well-being, Japan must at this time prepare for the day when the partition of China becomes an active question. We must create the foundations in a timely manner in order that we may participate in this process from a position of strength. So that was the basic idea. Manchuria would be the basis of a Japanese foothold in China, so that when China inevitably was carved up by imperial powers into spheres of influence, Japan would have a position to begin its own sphere from. What exactly that position would look like was a matter of some debate among more bullish army leaders who felt Manchuria could serve as a bulwark for Japan and a commercial colony, and more bearish ones who felt that it was strategically important but would be a huge money sink, as well as civilian leaders who were worried that an overly aggressive stance would as well as civilian leaders who were still worried about antagonizing Western powers like the UK with an overly aggressive position. Ultimately, the terms of the final peace deal with Russia granted Japan control of the Liaodong Peninsula, a victory for Japanese nationalists who were mad about having to give it up 10 years earlier. Japan also got control of the South Manchuria Railway from Dalian up to the interior city of Changchun, with the remaining railway staying under Russian control. It was something, but not as much as many people wanted. There were actually riots in Tokyo when the treaty terms were announced because the limited territorial gains and a lack of a cash payment from Russia to cover the costs of the war were so minimal when government propaganda had made the war look like a crushing victory. Somewhat ominously, as the terms were still being finalized, the Army's Quartermaster General, Iguchi Shogo, drafted a report for Field Marshal Oyama Iwao on his vision for Manchuria's future. Iguchi wrote, quote, "Regardless of our government's policy regarding Manchuria after the settlement of peace terms, it is essential that we begin to lay the foundation for developing the wealth of Manchuria and securing yet newer concessions. For this reason, I believe it is urgent we begin investigating immediately the potential value of Manchuria. We should release these findings to the general public promptly to provide them with a reliable compass needle." In other words, we have to prove this territory is worth something and that economically we can gain from it. After all, if Meiji imperialism was the art of the possible, then proving it was possible for new concessions to be worth it for the empire directly was very important. So here was how Japan first entered Manchuria in a permanent way in 1906, via control of the Liaodong Peninsula and the old Russian concessions in the region. What would emerge from that was a rather unique colonial arrangement in the nation's history, but we'll get to that next week. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com, and you can support us on Patreon. Special thanks to new patron Vivek for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 2.